morning of the Asia Cup final, 10 months before the World Cup final, we were preparing to play Sri Lanka in Sri Lanka. And the question that Gary Kirsten asked was, if this is the World Cup final, are we ready as a team to go out and win? And the answer between Gary and myself and Eric Simons, the bowling coach, was there. All of us answered no. We don't think we are ready right now to win a World Cup final. And the question then was, okay, so what do we need to do in the next 10 months to prepare the team? And the conversation that followed from there really laid the foundation for what are all the things we need to do. And one of the things we needed to consider was the fact that no team had won a World Cup at home up until then, and on home soil. And the thinking was because of the amount of home pressure on that home team. And when we extrapolated that, it was very clear that playing a final in Mumbai at the Wankhede Stadium, which is one of the noisiest stadiums in the world, in Sachin Tendulkar's last World Cup game, there would be no higher pressure moment than any of those players have ever played under or will play under in the rest of their lives, probably. So we had to prepare for the highest pressure situation that any player would have played under. Well, that 2nd of April was set up. Every single team meeting and conversation, we would start everyone when we play the final in Mumbai or when we play the final on the 2nd of April. So that by the time we got to that place, it had been in players' minds over and over and over. So in going into that final, we probably experienced less pressure than probably most teams have experienced going into a final, because we were so mentally prepared for that moment. And that's half the battle is won if you can arrive at a moment that big and not be overwhelmed by the magnitude of the situation. So I would say a fair degree of winning that game had already been done before we arrived. Driving from the hotel to the Wankhede Stadium is maybe normally about a 15-minute drive. This time it was about a 40-minute drive, because the streets were absolutely jam-packed and lined with spectators and people who we knew were just going to be outside of the stadium. So that, before we arrived at the stadium, just drove home, the magnitude of the experience. And so much of our work, certainly the support staff, was to try and keep players focused on just playing cricket. Bowlers bowling one ball at a time, batsmen watching the ball, facing one ball at a time, and focus on the cricket, not focus on the end result 100 overs later. So, yeah, those are things that really stood out in the big picture. One would have loved to have really performed in the final with a bat. Number one was Virender Sehwag. The nature of Sehwag's game is that if he had batted 15 overs, playing his usual flamboyant game, he would have taken the game away from the Sri Lankan team within 15 overs. We would have been so far ahead of the game. I know I was secretly hoping that Sehwag would do that, because it would just relieve so much pressure on the entire batting innings. So when Sehwag got out fairly early, all of us knew, okay, so we're going to have to work hard here. Viru's not going to make it easy in a short space of time like he had done in previous games. And then, of course, the consummate professional, the professor of cricket, Sachin Tendulkar, in his home game, when Sachin nicked off and got caught behind, that was two really big names and two really big players back in the change room when we still had a significant bulk of that target to chase down. And it wasn't a low target, but it certainly wasn't a very high target either. It was an average target for a World Cup game. But the reality is that you had two of the best high pressure players in the team still, one of them at the crease, Gautam Gambhir. Gary Kirsten used to call him the Rock. He spent most of his career as Sehwag's sidekick. Sehwag would be the guy who was on the highlights package and play the flamboyant cricket and get the crowds cheering, and Gambhir would just squirt the ball or that square drive behind backward point. He wouldn't get the crowd going, and he wouldn't make the highlights package. But Gambhir was the glue that kept that great batting lineup of sort of that era together, with the Sehwags and the Tendulkars and the Yuvraj Singhs of the world. So the fact that Gauti was still there, we had the rock, the glue that was going to hold the team together there. And of course, you know, although he had not delivered with a bat for 7 games until then, you know, MS Dhoni was at the time, and probably still is, one of the best in the world when it comes to a second innings chase, white ball cricket, seeing his batting team across the line and transferring the pressure back onto the bowlers. So we really did have, in truth, our two biggest guns or two biggest bullets were still in the chamber in those two. And, you know, that if it was scripted, what was probably going to happen, it would have been those two seeing at home. If we could have had written the script ourselves, it would have been Sehwag smashing and entertaining us with some flamboyant shots, and Sachin at his home ground in his final World Cup, seeing the team across and getting his 90 not out and winning the man of the match in the final. That would have been what we'd all love to write, but what was more predictable was what happened. The two guys who the best under really high pressure, seeing us across the line in Gambhir and Dhoni. We had a fairly set team at the time. It would have been quite predictable who the sort of core 8 or 9 players would be, and it was fairly predictable then at least who maybe 12 or 13 of the 15 would have been. We probably could have picked a squad of 18, and we would have been accurate that 15 of those 18 would have made it. So we were quite settled then. It already 10 months out was a fairly mature one-day team. We'd been together a long time. And we certainly saw ourselves continuing through with a very similar team that was already set and already doing well. It wouldn't have been smart, and it certainly wasn't necessary to make any significant personnel changes in terms of both playing and coaching staff. No, we were nicely set. We just needed to fine tune and lay a more solid foundation than what we'd ever laid before in order to withstand the pressure of a World Cup at home and a final in Mumbai. So there was no conversation around Dhoni promoting himself to number 4. It was just Dhoni knows that he hadn't delivered for 7 games, but he knew that a final like that really was set up for someone like Dhoni and his ability under high pressure. We had spoken in the team that when the time is right during the course of the entire campaign, that each person needed to stand up and be counted when it was their time. And Dhoni knew that was his moment to stand up. He's the high pressure player. He's the best man for the job. He knew it. And Dhoni always stays inside of the change room during the batting innings. He never comes outside of the change room and sits in with the players outside in the dugout. I was sitting next to Gary Kirsten outside of the change room, and we just heard a knock on the window, and Dhoni was standing there padded up, and he just indicated to Gary, he just sort of said batting next, and he pointed to himself. That's all it was, just 3 little hand gestures, and Gary knew exactly what he meant, and Gary just nodded his head. So it was a deep knowing and deep courage and unbelievable leadership from Dhoni to take that decision. And certainly Gary Kirsten backed it, and the two of them, you know, the two leaders of that team were on the same page, and it was just a simple hand gesture and a nod, both of them knowing that is what needs to be done. Very, very courageous decision at the time, because had Dhoni got out, he would have been significantly criticized for going out so early on in the innings, for going ahead of Yuvraj Singh, who was in such form. So it was a risky decision. But I still remember when Dhoni walked down the stairs, I turned to Gary Kirsten, I said, do you realize Dhoni's going out there to fetch us the World Cup? And I just had such a deep confidence that he was going to come off that field carrying the World Cup for us. Without a shadow of a doubt, it is a head and shoulders the most significant experience of my entire life, never mind my professional life. It was, you know, an unbelievable highlight. I don't know how long that incredible electricity of ecstasy was buzzing through every cell, every vein, every nerve of my body, within me. And it was just ignited by the celebration that was going on immediately around us, within the players and the support staff. And then within that stadium, it's arguably the loudest stadium in the world, the Wankhede Stadium. And the noise in there, it was just electrifying. I think all of us were just, everyone there was firing each other up into an experience that I've never experienced before. I'm not sure I'll ever get to experience it. And if one day I can find out how to bottle that experience and give people a pull, I will be the richest man in the world without a shadow of a doubt. You know, the post-match celebration was slightly different to most that I would have experienced, in that the first thing we did was we got the wives and the children in. So what that did, it just brought a different energy. It brought a different dynamic into the change room. It made it a family celebration, as opposed to a bunch of men celebrating and singing and jumping up and down and screaming and maybe drinking a beer for those who did drink a beer. It was quite a measured, mature, family type celebration. And I think sort of the drinking a couple of beers and listening some loud music and maybe having a dance, that happened well later that night. But it was wonderful to have the families and the children in there, or the people that had supported the players in the background through the journey, through their careers, and to be there with us was wonderful to have them inside the change room. But it made it a different celebration.